What's going on, PFR Nation? This is Kevin Lau, your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast. And today we're going to be talking about annual gifting. And we're going to be talking a little about the federal estate tax exemption because a lot of you have been probably hearing over the last few years, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is going to sunset at the end of 2025, and we're going to go back to the old rules. And, how is that going to impact, taxable estates? And you're going to owe all these taxes when you pass away. Okay, well, listen, I've definitely mentioned that before because in the law right now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is supposed to sunset at the end of 2025. Okay, but now Trump has won the presidential race, and it's very likely he's also going to have control of the Senate and the House. And so I'm just going to I'm going to go off on a limb here and just say the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is very likely to get extended beyond 2025 and even potentially made permanent. Okay, so that is going to limit the number of you who are going to have taxable estates at death from the federal level. Now, at the state level, you might still have state estate taxes. I think there are 13 states that have an estate tax in addition to the federal estate tax. So again, if you are above your state's limits, you might have a state estate tax. It's hard to say. But we're going to focus on the federal exemption. We're going to focus on annual gifting. And I'm going to just talk a little about the benefits of annual gifting in general. Even if you're not above this taxable estate, this federal taxable estate, you might still see value in gifting during your lifetime to see your beneficiaries utilize that inheritance as opposed to waiting until you pass away to leave them a large windfall. So why don't we jump into the whiteboard here? So the first thing to really unpack is this idea of a basic exclusion amount. So for 2024, the basic exclusion amount is $13,610,000. Okay, so what this basic exclusion amount applies to is the taxable estate at death. So when someone passes away, if your taxable estate is above this amount, you're going to have a federal estate tax due. If it's below that amount, you're not going to have a federal estate tax due. Now, if you're married and your spouse is a U.S. citizen, you can multiply this number by 2. So now what do we get? About 27.22. Okay. So as you can see, not many people have taxable estates. I think there are less than 1% or around 1% of returns that are filed at death have a federal estate tax due. So it's not the majority for sure. And even you PFR Nation, you overachievers, are likely to be below this amount. Okay, so for 2025, we just had another inflation adjustment here. So 13.99. And then again, if you're married to a U.S. citizen, multiply that by 2, and then you've got about 27.98. Okay, so again, pretty high amounts. And how do we get here? Well, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled this basic exclusion amount from 2017. So in 2017, I think the number was right around $5 million. So it doubled to about $10 million and some change. And it's been adjusting for inflation each and every year. And that is likely to continue beyond 2025, because I'm just going to predict that just because the Republicans do have control in the White House and in Congress, that is very likely the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is extended and potentially even made permanent. So what I'm saying is you may not be worried about federal estate taxes. Now, sure, if you own a business or if you're gonna be selling a business at some point in time and all of a sudden you have a huge windfall and you're above this amount, okay, you might want to do some estate tax planning at that point in time. But doing a bunch of things now in anticipation that you're going to be way above the basic exclusion amount at death without really knowing how long you're going to live, the number of times that this is likely going to change over time, before you pass away, it's very, very difficult to just say, hey, do this now to plan for the potential estate tax due at your death. So unless you're above these amounts or you're very, very close to these amounts today, you probably don't need to worry a ton about federal estate taxes, okay? But what about gifting? Okay, what about just gifting during your lifetime? Okay, so even though you might not be above the federal estate tax, that you still might think about giving to your children. And let's say you have a child, an adult child that you want to give money to. Maybe they're starting their families, or maybe they're buying their first house and you're just trying to figure out a way to help them out without triggering gift taxes. So for 2024, an individual, a donor, can give up to $18,000 without filing a gift tax return. This is one thing I did want to clarify in the Trump versus Harris podcast, the taxes podcast that came out last Thursday. I think I was talking a little bit about annual gift exclusions, and I think one of the listeners interpreted that 18,000 is the max you can give. That is not true. Okay. I didn't mean to say that. So I apologize and thank you for catching that. But 18,000 is the max you can give per beneficiary, per donor, without having to file a gift tax return, which I think is Form 706. So if you give more than this amount, you just file the gift tax return, and that is going to reduce it's going to reduce dollar for dollar the basic exclusion amount at your death. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you're married though, and you have one adult child you want to give money to, now you can multiply this number by 2 for a total of 36K. Okay. And now if you have multiple children, let's say you have 2 children, you can multiply that number by 2 for a total of 72K. So you can see how these numbers really add up. And by the way, they don't even need to be family members per se to give. So you can give to really anybody. You can give to your neighbor. If you don't have children, you can just give money to friends or neighbors or people you really like. Of course, charitable giving, there is no exclusion. You don't have to worry about the gift tax exclusion at all. Okay. Same thing with things like tuition payments or education payments. So if, let's say, your grandchild is in school and you're like, hey, I want to, write a check for $50,000 to pay for their, their first year at Yale. You can just write a check for $50,000 directly to Yale, and you're not going to have to worry about filing Form 706 or impacting your basic exclusion amount at death. Okay. There are also some other things like medical expenses that you can sort of add back and credit to your taxable estate at the end. Political contributions, same thing. And then, of course, gifts to spouses and dependents as well. So for 2025, simply we just had an inflation adjustment. Now it's $19,000 that you can give without triggering any gift tax return for that particular year. So then if you're married, giving to one beneficiary, that's, multiply that by 2. Now you've got 38K that you can give as a married couple to each beneficiary. And then if you have multiple beneficiaries you want to give to, just multiply it by the number of beneficiaries. And that gives you the total amount that you can possibly give without filing Form 706. But like I mentioned, even if you gifted more, let's say you gifted $1 million, okay, and during 2024, let's say, and so you subtract out $18,000 because that's the annual gift exclusion, $982,000 is your taxable gift for 2024. So that will simply reduce dollar for dollar this amount here. So you're still going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,500,000 roughly that you can give during your lifetime or at death without having to trigger any federal estate taxes. Okay, so again, these gift tax apply to those taxable gifts that you exceed, but nothing is due until you pass away or until you use all of that basic exclusion amount. And anything in excess of that is going to filter through these tax brackets. So it is a marginal system. So the first $10,000 is going to be taxed at 18%. The next $10,000 will be at 20%. So sort of a gradual bracket all the way up to this 40% bracket for anything over $1 million. So certainly if you're $3, $4, $5 million in excess of your basic exclusion amount, your beneficiaries are probably going to have a 7-figure tax bill or multiple 7-figure tax bill due at death. So you just want to make sure that they're going to have the liquidity available to pay those federal estate taxes. Of course, that could be used from investments that you have, cash on hand, selling assets, life insurance, whatever it might be, raise that liquidity in order to pay those federal estate taxes. So just keep that in mind that these taxes are going to be applied at death, not while you're giving on an annual basis. Even if you give in excess of that annual exclusion amount, you're simply just going to be reducing this basic exclusion amount that is available to you again in 2024, 2025. We know what these numbers are. And then in 2026, this will continue to likely adjust for inflation. I'll probably come back and revisit this towards the end of 2025 because there's probably going to be lots of talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2025 because 2026 is when that is set to sunset. So hopefully this is helpful, PFR Nation. Again, many of you are probably not going to have federal estate taxes due, but you still might want to take advantage of the lifetime gifting. Maybe you've saved well. Maybe you have $5-6 million saved, and you're like, hey, listen, I'm not going to be spending all of this during my lifetime. I keep our expenses pretty low. We don't really need or want for anything. We're just doing what we want to do when we want to do it. And maybe you have $1 million or $2 million that's very likely to be left at the end of your life to your children. Okay, but you might just kind of think through, okay, when is the utility of money going to be at its peak for my kids or my beneficiaries? All right. Is it when they're 70 or 80 years old, or is it when they're 40 or 50 or 60 years old? Okay, probably the latter. I mean, I'll just give you an example. I just had a client of mine who's 70 years old, and her dad passed away in his late 90s. And, he left her several $100,000, but my client has been retired for almost a decade at this point in time. This is going to make no real material impact to her retirement plan. So could she have used that, however, 10 years ago or 15 years ago when she was still planning for retirement? Probably yes. I do believe that would have made more of a material impact. Now, hindsight's 2020, should dad have given her annual gifts during lifetime? Probably, but I don't know if he really had an advisor that was in his corner to really bring this up and say, you know what, Mr. and Mrs. Klein, you're very likely to have $1 million surplus or $500,000 surplus at the end of your life. Do you want to start doing some giving now so you can actually see your beneficiaries enjoy the gift? So this idea of giving with a warm hand versus a cold one. Okay, that's really the first reason. People love, my clients that are doing this love to actually see their beneficiaries use the money. And again, thinking through, number two, the utility of money. When is that at its peak for your beneficiaries? And if you live until 85 or 95, how old will your beneficiaries be at that point in time? Okay, and so if they can use some of those dollars earlier on, that could be value there, so they can really maximize the use of that inheritance. And I would say number three is actually watching, being able to sort of watch and observe. How are your beneficiaries using the money you give them? All right. So if your beneficiaries are just blowing it on sports betting or something, something that's, frivolous in nature, and you're sort of not really happy with what they're doing with those dollars that you give them, that might be a sign that you might want to think through your estate plan or rethink your estate plan. Maybe it's setting up some sort of irrevocable trust for that beneficiary. Maybe it's limiting the amount of money you give to that beneficiary, or limit the access of money for that beneficiary when you do pass away. On the flip side, if the beneficiaries, let's say they're being wise with those dollars you give them. They're maximizing those investments that they have on their own balance sheet. They're giving it to their children. They're spending it on education expenses. They're using it for those, those home purchases or those major expenses that are really important in their life. That's probably a sign that that beneficiary is responsible with money. And so maybe you're not as concerned with setting up some sort of irrevocable trust, or not as concerned about liquidity at your death in terms of leaving a large windfall to that particular beneficiary. Okay. So even if you don't have an estate tax problem, you still might consider these lifetime gifts in order just to watch the beneficiaries use the money. Again, I go back to this giving with a warm hand versus a cold one. The value of money, utility of money tends to go down the older that we get, just because there's fewer ways we can use those dollars. Okay. When you're 78 years old, are you taking the same type of vacations that you were in your 40s and 50s? Probably not. Okay. So just thinking about the utility of money, and also just being able to see those gifts in action and what your beneficiaries are using those gifts for. So hope you all found this helpful, PFR Nation. If you found it helpful, of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss out on these whiteboard fireside chats, and you also don't want to miss out when we drop our podcast every other week on Thursdays. And as always, PFR Nation, I appreciate you guys tuning in. I appreciate your support. And until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.